Welcome to another episode of Speak Up, the television arm of Freemasonry in New Zealand. I am Barry Rushton, your host, and we have an enlightened show for you this evening. My first guest is a young Freemason. He's the master of his lodge in Orewa. He is going to tell us about why young men are joining Freemasonry. My second guest is the oldest member of that same lodge, Mr. Harry Camish. He's nearly 96 and as sharp as a tack. And he's going to tell us a story about when their bomber got shot down over France and he escaped through Spain back to England. A wonderful story. Rounding out the program, of course, is our regular contributor, Graham Houston. Craig McFarlane, nice to see you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Barry.
Great to have a young Freemason on the show. Now, I know that we could be called that we're just having an old people sort of organisation, but it's far from that. Winston Churchill said something in the 20th century. He said that Freemasonry's got a lot to offer the 20th century, more than the 20th century's got to offer Freemasonry. And I'm sure that's pretty much the same today. So what makes young guys like yourself join Freemasonry?
Well, I think, Barry, it's an individual pursuit. Now, initially I started off, Freemasonry was very entrenched in my family. My grandfather was a Freemason, and so was my father and my uncle. And growing up, we knew about it. The kids and the cousins all knew about Freemasonry, but it was never spoken about. And it wasn't until I left the Navy and an old former Navy colleague of mine approached me one day and says, what do you know about Freemasonry? And I sat back and I said, probably a bit more than you'll give me credit for. And the rest is history.
Great.
But it's helped me a lot. And I think any young person who's sort of trying to find their feet in the world, perhaps, I think Freemasonry's got a very lot to offer in terms of how we conduct ourselves both as a person and in our professional lives as well.
See, I know your lodge has initiated a number of younger people. Are you still finding that's the same sort of connection that they're looking for themselves? Not necessarily historically with their family, but they're actually searching for something, part of belonging, do you think?
Yes, that's correct. And also there's, as you are aware, Freemasonry's got a long history and a lot of tradition. And I think a lot of the younger brethren, as we call them, that are coming through are sort of looking for that and trying to connect to something along those lines.
You see, I think that's a very good point, because it does seem to, I have a number of younger children too, and you know, sometimes you say to yourself, gee, I'm glad I'm not a young kid today, or even trying to start a young family. They've got huge pressures on them. They've got lots of different distractions. They sort of look around. There's all these new fandangled gadgets. They've got pressure on them. They've got, you know, they can't get a mortgage or get a house. There's lots of things that go on. And it seems like even in communities there's tension, you know. So why do you think, what makes a young man seek for some of these old-fashioned values that Freemasonry espouses?
I think it's trying to connect back to the roots of being a person. Freemasonry offers a lot of very good things in terms of making what we consider good men better. Modern society, I believe, doesn't cater for that anymore. We're so bent by, as you said, social pressures that there's nothing to sort of hold on to or nothing to connect to. Freemasonry sort of stops time, if you like, and allows us to reconnect not only with ourselves but with the members of the lodge as well.
I'm finding also too that there's sort of a need amongst men of all kind that they need to actually do some good in the communities that they live in. There's a basic intrinsic need there, especially was in my age group. Are you finding the same thing with the younger ones? Do they want to get behind stuff? And
Definitely, and that's something that Freemasonry offers as well, is a very strong charity focus. And it's a good feel-good when you put something together, you see it through and you look at the benefits at the end, and it's really, really good to see that and to help the community as well.
Quite so. You know, in the Freemasons meetings, you know, a lot of things are done in ritual, and in those rituals there are great moral truths, you know. I mean, is there something, I know there is, but is there something that sits with these young kids, or young men I should say, with regards to things of value, moral truth, being I would treat you as I want you to treat me. Is that what they're looking for as well?
That's right, and one of the morals is brotherly love, relief and truth. And basically what that says is that I'll be true to myself, I'll be true to my fellow brethren, if you like, as well as my community. And that's something that I think is very, very important. And that's what Freemasonry teaches you once you start stripping everything back.
Great. You see, you could say that Freemasonry is an association of men who believe in the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. In saying that, How would you interpret those two statements?
So the fatherhood of God, I think Freemasonry does ask us to believe in a superior being, and that's it. But it is not it doesn't discriminate against any form of religion. And I've sat in the lodge rooms with people from the Jewish faith and from the Muslim faith as well. And I'm very privileged to have done that. There's no conception, no issues around that as well.
And so with regards to the brotherhood, I mean, we know also that there's an obligation. I mean, with comes responsibility, comes an obligation.
Yes.
Right? And that obligation is not just to you and your fellow brethren. It's to whom else? It's to your.
It's also to our family.
Yeah.
And that's something that we tend to forget. But our family is a very big supporter of Freemasonry. Without them, as I say, without them, nothing. Because if my wife and my kids don't support me in my journey, then what's the point of going out?
Quite so. Part of the Freemasonry event evening is the social side,
yes.
is the refectory after the meeting. That's where, of course, everybody gets together and they have a bit of time together. With the demands on younger people, you know, and the range of entertainment that they can go to, can be a part of, what is the strong part about you joining in the refectory, talking to men of equal stature, if I can say that term, as a brother? What's the bit that you really love out of Freemasonry in the refectory aspect?
That social connection, and that one-on-one or that FaceTime is maybe modern people might believe in. I think too many times now we're all pinned to our mobile devices, and whilst social media's got a lot to offer, it doesn't give me that experience to have that conversation and to actually engage with other men, if you like, on both a professional and a social level.
Now, I know that you are active in Freemasonry. I think this is your third term third time as master. Now, that's good for a young guy because you have to do the things through the system before you become a master. What's the one enduring thing, if you can sort of pull it out of there, that makes you stay involved?
I enjoy it.
Wow.
I enjoy it. And it also gives me, I don't use this word lightly, a sense of belonging. I always feel welcome. I feel welcome whether I'm in the lodge in Auckland, whether I'm in the lodge in Taranaki, or even in Christchurch. I always feel welcome. So I guess it's that sense of belonging. But most of all, I enjoy it.
Great stuff. Well, Craig, it's been great having you on the show. Young men like you, there's a lot of them in Freemasonry, and I really appreciate you taking the time for being here.
And thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Thank you. From one of the youngest members of Lodge Orewa to perhaps the most senior member of them all, Harry Camish, it is an absolute delight to have you here, sir.
Nice to be here.
Oh, it's good. Sir, you're nearly 96.
Yes.
You're as sharp as a tack, which I came up the other day and had a chat to you for about an hour and a half. I wanted to stay for about 3 hours, but I had to get back home. But it was a delight. And you've been 50 years in Freemasonry. Congratulations, my
53,
friend.
actually, yes.
53? 53.
Yes, I joined in 65.
That's fantastic. We'll come to that in a moment or two. You've made some contributions to a book which I regret I didn't have with me, but I'm going to put a shot up, and it's called Kiwis Can Fly, and it's a collection of, I think, all aviator stories from New Zealand of the time in the Second World War. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you've got a couple of beauties in there, right?
Yes, yeah.
Now, we talk about World War II, and this discussion tonight's got nothing to do with the horrors of war that you went through that we only could know about. But there are some amusing stories in there, Harry, and I want to chuck you into that. I want our viewers to have the laughter that I had at your house about 2 or 3 days ago. So I want to chuck you in it. I want you to tell us again about the crash on takeoff of your Lancaster bomber.
Well, we were just a new crew arrived at the station, and in the training stations you don't practice with a full bomb load. When you get onto an operational station, of course, you've got another 12,000 pounds of weight to consider. And our pilot was a young inexperienced pilot like they all were, and I was a flight engineer. I operated the throttles and such forth. And unfortunately, the Lancaster has a tendency to swing to the port, which is left.
The left-hand side right there.
And once you've lost control, that's it. You can't get back on the runway. And we headed for a hangar, and as you heading for the hangar at nearly 100 miles an hour, I'm thinking to myself, what's my mother going to think about this? Anyhow, we caught the hanger with our port wing and spun round, and the Lancaster broke in two with the rear gunner in his turret being fed with hydraulic oil, and he was ablaze in the turret. And as I say, I can't remember exactly what happened, but I finished up running across the aerodrome, over the perimeter fence, and out into the village, down into the village, and knocking on the door of the first cottage that I came to, and this elderly gentleman came to the door, and I said, I've just come from a bomber which is going to explode any minute, which of course put real panic into the old fella. Anyhow, he invited me in. His wife said, would you like a cup of tea? And I learned all this afterwards because I was in a state
of shock.
I was in a state of shock. She invited me in for a cup of tea, and the old gentleman went down to the local policeman, which was just one fella. And he came back and he said, and where are you from, son? I said, I'm from RAF Skellingthorpe. And what's happened? I said, we've crashed and there's a fun bomb boat going to go off any minute now, which of course caused a bit of panic to the old gentleman. So he rode back on his bicycle to phone up the Skellingthorpe, and he said, I think we've got one of your crew members here. Well, secrecy is the main thing on the aerodrome. And they said, oh, what is he? And he said, oh, I don't know. Well, you better go back and see what he is. So the policeman came back and said, what are you, son? I said, I'm the engineer. Oh, right. And off he went back to phone up the station and tell them that there was the engineer. And he said, I heard them at the other end say, we found the engineer. He's down in this village about so many miles away, which of course caused great consternation. But eventually the blood wagon arrived and I went into the military hospital.
And the plane did in actual fact blow up, right?
The plane went up about 50 minutes later while I was still in the hospital.
And a big hole in the ground, right?
A big hole in the ground, very much so.
See, we can only picture these sort of stories, but as kids we used to get the war comics, and they were so beautifully drawn, and you can just picture this Bobby on his bike, cycling back with the hat on, the helmet, coming back, and so proper, so proper.
Well, things are slightly different in wartime.
Now, again, the other story that I want you to jump right into this one, excuse the pun, of course, right, but I wanted to know the time that you bailed out. Now, I know you're on a sortie, I believe, and you got shot down, right? Yeah. This is a fabulous story.
Well, this is another case. When I came out of the hospital, I was assigned as spare bod. In other words, a spare bod is a spare engineer. So it was not a very nice job at all, because I had to replace any engineer in another crew that was probably sick or something like that. Well, crews are very much family affairs, and any newcomer into a crew isn't really welcomed until he's proved his worth. So I didn't really enjoy the next few operations, and I was thinking about going out to Lincoln Village to enjoy the few beers in the Saracen's Head. Everybody in Lincoln will know the Saracen's Head. And a call came over the tannoy, report for duty, you're flying tonight, and so that was it. I had to get ready for another operation, which was my 16th. And I got, funnily enough, all the other flights I've been with, I felt okay, but with this one, I was slightly uneasy, but there's nothing you can do about it. You've got to go. And so off we went. And we were about 20 minutes off our target in southern Germany, and we got hit by the night fighter, and we went down in flames. It was every man for himself. And we have the front escape hatch, which is very small. It would be about very small indeed. And when you've got your parachute harness on and everything, it's very difficult to get out of. And the bomber, who was the first one out, was jumping on the door, and his weight, he was a big man, but his weight wouldn't do the door. And the pilot was getting quite anxious because we were just going down right? faster and faster, and gravity, pulling on gravity, was very heavy on the body. And anyhow, the bomb aimer disappeared, and I floated out after him, jumped on it, and landed in about 2 feet of snow.
In the middle of a paddock, right?
And
How lucky was that?
You think that the Germans waiting for you with bayonets and rifles and all sorts of thoughts go through your mind.
I bet.
Am I going to land in a tree? Am I going to land on a steeple with a nice spire sticking up you know where? And all these things float through your head, and then when you hit the ground with a bump, you feel quite relieved.
I bet.
And we were almost told to get as far away as possible from where we landed, so I took to my heels and headed west. You want to tell me about the train?
And you buried the
I buried the parachute.
Buried the parachute, yeah.
In the snow, yes. Buried the parachute in the snow, and we were issued with a suede type of flying boot, which isn't very good for walking. And I headed west and got to this railway line, and I heard a boop, boop, boop in the distance, and I thought, a train, what better way to get away from to jump on a train? So I'm standing by the railway tracks, and this train went by about 80 miles an hour, and the blast blew me off my feet. So that was a no-no. I walked a considerable length of time and eventually came to a small village, well, a railway station mainly, and I walked into the door, and the poor old station master looked up at me with full uniform on, and he knew immediately what I was, because they always heard the aircraft going overhead. And he took me into the little village, and I got into this little two-bedroom cottage with this, well, I think he must have been a farm labourer and his wife, and I stayed there for 3 days.
Right.
And there was just 2 rooms in there. The main room was the big bedroom with a massive what we'd call a king-size bed today. And I stayed there for 3 days, and the question is, what position were you in the bed, in the middle or on the outside?
Because apparently the people in the railway stations, they were quite sympathetic to English flyers, weren't they?
I didn't know it at the time, but the French had several escape lines which they picked up down Dairman like this. There was a lot going down in those days. They picked up down Dairman, and then they sent you along the escape route, you see. So I was, but the problem here was when I was in this cottage, and when this gentleman came to the door, and in perfect English, he asked me what squadron I was on, where I was going, what target it was, and I had to explain to him that I didn't really know the names of the crew, which made him very suspicious.
Yeah.
And I said, no, I was a spare engineer, and I know the name of the pilot, but not of the other crew. Anyhow, he went off, and he came back the next day. Everything must have been okay. They must have been in touch with England. And I was accepted. And funnily enough, out in the little square outside this little village was a notice on the wall, $10,000 reward, 10,000 francs reward for any airman reporting.
Wow.
They knew we were in the vicinity, and they were searching for us. You know.
So what a temptation for someone to turn you in.
10,000 francs was a lot of money to villagers, poor villagers, and yet they knew I was there. The rest of the village knew I was there, and they used to make any excuse to come in and see.
Have a look at you.
Have a look at this English airman.
So you finally got some papers. You were.
Then from there I went to the next town, and it was a couple of ladies, middle-aged ladies, that had a form of dress shop. I stayed with them for a while I got these false papers printed.
Yep.
And they got me down as Louis Blanc, and I was a painter from some
little town.
And then I was passed along the routes, with quite a lot of events happened along the routes. In one place I stayed with a high police official, funnily enough. He had the key to the local armoury, and he said that when our boys arrive, he'd unlock the armoury and give it out to the...
So you got up to about Paris, right? Then you actually caught a train down to Toulouse, right?
Yes, I got to Paris and stayed with... I had a good look at the Eiffel Tower from where I was in Paris. And from there I went down to Toulouse, then across to the foot of the Pyrenees, and then over the Pyrenees, which... I was on my own at that particular stage because the group I was with had been betrayed, and we were surrounded by...
This is at the base of the Pyrenees,
This is at
right?
the base of the Pyrenees, yeah. they'd been betrayed, and I was unfortunate to break away in the right direction.
Race off, right?
Race off, yeah, with the bullets and the dogs barking and every goddamn noise under the sun.
It's then over the Pyrenees in the cold and the dark, and
Yes,
there's funny little shoes and boots that you had on and clothes, right?
In a railway porter's suit and real thin shoes, yes. And you see them today with all this gear to go over the mountains. That's all I had.
So you eventually got down into Spain.
I got into Spain,
Yeah.
whereas once I got over the mountains, the British Embassy, someone phoned the British Embassy to say there was an airman. From that moment onwards, it was all
handed down.
All handed. Oh
you
yes,
went to Gibraltar, right, and then back home.
Gibraltar and home, and when I got to Gibraltar, that's when my mother got the telegram to say, your son will sooner be arriving in England after 13 weeks waiting to see what happened to her. He's still alive and kicking.
What a fantastic story. I know you have other ones too, and we would run out of time, but there's one
Yes.
other question I would love to ask you. I know that you would have enjoyed the camaraderie of the soldiers at the time. It's just that's what happened.
Yeah.
Was that one of the things that sort of made you gravitate towards Freemasonry?
Actually, the experience I had there made me very community-minded, my wife and I. And when we came to England, when we came to New Zealand, I joined the RSA, I joined the Lions Club, and eventually I was accepted into Freemasonry. And the thing about Freemasonry I found was that they did all this vast amount of work that never sought publicity.
Yeah, which is great, isn't it?
And I was quite taken
by that.
I met some really fine men and their wives in Freemasonry.
Harry, thank you very much, mate. It's been great having you as a special guest. I'm going to come up to your house again some stage soon, and we're going to go over a few more stories.
Yeah, well, bring the beer with you.
I will. And rounding up the program this evening is our regular contributor, Graham Houston. Graham?
Hello, Barry.
Our last guest, as you know, was a bit of a military man, and I believe you've got a military guest or that you'd like to talk about today.
Certainly have. This is a guy that was perhaps little known, certainly outside of New Zealand, not particularly well known within New Zealand, and certainly when he left here, not at all. And that is Major Henry de Burgh Adams.
It's an odd name, I have to admit.
Yes, he was actually born in Canada in about 1830, and although he grew up there, the family moved over to Ireland. His father was in the army, and so it was a natural progression that he actually joined the army. His father was a major, and Henry de Burgh Adams went on to become a major in the army too. He was they call a principal purveyor in the army, probably the equivalent of today's quartermaster general in the army. He served in Crimea, and he served at Sebastopol before coming to New Zealand. And of course, when he came to New Zealand, he of course was involved with the Taranaki and the Waikato military campaigns of that time. He arrived in New Zealand, but when he arrived in New Zealand in the 1850s, Auckland was probably pretty buoyant. People were enthusiastic. It seemed to be a progressive sort of society, and there was a garrison of the Albert Street Barracks of 1,000 odd men that were in there, and generally things were good. But then things changed. By 1865, things changed. The capital of Auckland, the capital of New Zealand, had moved from Auckland to Wellington. There were up to 10,000 troops stationed around Auckland. The males between 16 and 65 were suddenly called up and conscripted because the wars had started to increase, and Auckland felt itself a little bit under threat, particularly through South Auckland, and you may recall the military establishments down around Jury, and so Auckland became a bit depressed. The interesting thing about de Burgh Adams, he was right through that time, and he was very keen to make sure that the men in the service were actually catered for and looked after whilst they were here, both on duty and off duty. Back in 1852, he had joined the Freemasons, and he was initiated into the Lodge of Victoria, number 4, Irish Constitution in Dublin. And so that enthusiasm, plus the role that he held in the army, meant that he enthusiastically set about creating Masonic lodges.
He was only about 23 too, wasn't he?
He was, yes, he was only young.
Yeah.
And as you know that many of the military regiments that came and travelled overseas travelled with what they call travelling warrants, Masonic warrants, and that allowed them to set up Masonic lodges. He was responsible for creating 5 new lodges for the Irish Constitution throughout New Zealand. There was Sin Lodge, Onehunga Lodge, Alpha Waikato, Beta Waikato, and he was involved with the consecration of the Shamrock Lodge down in Dunedin. And if you look at the commonality of those lodges, you will find most of those had military connections. They were set up mainly for the servicemen. In fact, within 3 months of him arriving in Auckland, he joined the Ara Lodge in Auckland here, and the records show that in pursuing the interests of the servicemen, he had it so that they only paid half dues for the servicemen while they were on active duty, so that he was very involved in that. He became the provincial Grand Master, but there was no record of him actually ever being invested as a Grand Master. He was by appointment, I guess you could say, by appointment, because even because the records were not quite so. I believe the existing provincial Grand Master that at the time was actually domiciled in Australia, and he didn't really come to New Zealand. He went to New Plymouth. It's been a couple of years in New Plymouth, and he helped in establishing the lodge down in New Plymouth for the Irish Constitution, and that was named the De Burgh Adams Lodge.
Which is incredible, isn't it?
And it still exists today, over 150 years later. Yeah. And he is, as far as I'm aware, the only person who has had a lodge named after him whilst he is still alive. He went back to England and he died at age 39 from something that we take for granted today, uncomfortable to have, but they can fix. He died from a stomach ulcer, but in those days they couldn't fix it. To this day, there is a De Burgh Adams Lodge in Taranaki, New Zealand, and there are pictures of him, large pictures, in galleries in London.
Isn't this great?
And that was something that was reported in the newspaper. We don't see that today, but he was a very influential man, and in a quiet, unassuming way, and not a lot of people know the influence that he actually had here in New Zealand.
Adams, right?
Major Henry De Burgh Adams.
Great choice, Brian. Thank you. Thank you, mate. Great choice. See you next week. Well, that's our show for this week. Thank you for joining us. Remember, if you'd like to know anything about Freemasonry, please do go to the Freemasons website, which is freemasonsnewzealand.org.nz, or otherwise just call the telephone number listed on the screen. Until I see you again, have a great week.